Thanks, Tim. My name is Andy Kang. I'm the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. Thanks so much for joining us today on this Saturday. For full disclosure, this discussion that is about to happen has been pre-recorded so that we would avoid any technical glitches and we'd have a great event. I'm very excited to share that we have four amazing leaders joining us today for this discussion. The first is State Representative Jennifer Gong-Gershowitz, representing the 17th District here in Illinois. Kristina Tendilla, the Executive Director of Fire Chicago. Patricia Gu-When, the Director of Undergraduate Studies and Assistant Professor of Asian American Studies at Northwestern University, also co-founder of Access Labs in Uptown, where our office is located. And Niketa Brar, Executive Director of Chicago United for Equity, or also known as CUE. Thank you so much for joining us. For those that are watching, just so you know, you should see in your chat the bios and the links to more information about these great speakers should be provided. But before we kick off into our discussion about the video that we all just watched, we did want to share some bonus footage that we pulled from the PBS website. We thought it was super relevant to the discussion we're about to have. And so we're going to play that right now for all of you. It runs about 2 minutes, and then we're going to begin the discussion with the speakers.
Yeah. I remember we were working when my father says, "Come on, we're leaving." I says, "We're leaving, it's 10 o'clock in the morning." So we left.
To go on strike, you suffer a lot of hardship. Maybe you get hungry, maybe you're gonna lose your car, maybe you're gonna lose your house.
And I remember leaving the field and driving through seeing the strikers of the Filipinos.
But the Filipinos face a dilemma. As they strike for a union, the farmers bring in Mexican workers to replace them.
It's one of the things I learned that farmers like to do. They like to pit the Mexicans against the Filipinos because you're going to be fighting for the same pot of gold.
Many Mexican laborers have already joined the National Farm Workers Association, led by the charismatic Cesar Chavez.
I remember meeting at the Filipino Community Hall in Toledo. All the labor contractors were there, and a lot of the farm workers were there, and they're trying to decide, are we going to end the strike? Or are we going to negotiate with the Mexicans to join us? And then Larry Leong says, I'm going to go talk to the Mexicans.
When the strike happened, Cesar Chavez wasn't really quite ready. But Cesar also knew that if they didn't join the Filipinos then it would never happen.
Larry approaches Cesar Chavez and his colleague Dolores Huerta. As one of AWOC's co-founders, her relationship with Larry and the Filipinos goes back years.
And then a couple days later, we're at this church. They're talking about the strike. They're discussing, should we go on strike or not go on strike? And all of a sudden there's a swelga. I said, what the heck swelga? Because I thought they were saying, hell no. I said, no, it means strike, we're going on strike. And so the Mexicans joined us.
Where are your brothers and sisters over here? Come on!
So that, of course, was the story of the 1965 Farmworker Strike that is very well known. More so for Cesar Chavez, we thought it was really important to share that story for purpose of this discussion. So I'm going to jump us off with one question that I'd love to hear from our esteemed panelists. Just watching that video, your thoughts, your feelings, what moved you from the video, and yeah, just share from your perspective as Asian Americans what those were.
Well, I'm happy to start. For me, watching these moments, I felt a personal connection to these stories, and for me, it was a reminder of the power of our shared experiences. But more than anything else, it just hit me on an emotional level. So thank you.
Again, so Kristina, and I'm the executive director of Alliance of Filipinos for Immigrant Rights and Empowerment. And I gotta say, just watching that clip, it always just grounds me in just this rich history of organizing that happened with the Filipino OAX community, with the broader Asian community, and also these examples of solidarity with other communities. And remembering also that struggle. And something that struck me too is that it didn't just happen. They didn't just say, okay, we'll work together. But there was deep relationships between workers and organizers that allowed that solidarity to happen. And so for me, watching that is really powerful, and it really grounds me to think about the struggle today for immigrants, for workers. You're on mute, Patricia.
Unmute.
Darn. Okay. Nope. So this documentary series is really powerful as it traces the history of Asian Americans from the Chinese Exclusion Act all the way to post 9/11, and really thinking and seeing the expansiveness of that history and the power of people mobilizing and organizing together that is centralized in this piece that I think is really significant, especially as it speaks to this moment, and the ways in which, as you were talking about the importance of solidarity, right? The importance of cross-racial alliances as people, laborers go on strike. And in this moment, we see essential workers, a lot who are undocumented, a lot of people who are immigrants and refugees who are on the front line in food services and meatpacking industries, in as nurses, right? Predominantly, a lot of nurses are Filipinx, right? So how do we think about the history and the legacy of this work as a way to encourage us in this moment to think about what we can do, how we can come together. And so for me, it was a hopeful opening in reviewing this history again.
Yeah, I think building off of that, Patricia, I feel like the component of history in sort of figuring out who we are and how we belong in this country and what our story of belonging is so important. I think a lot about, in my own upbringing, watching media like this is just not something that I grew up with. But I was really lucky because my dad is just like a, homegrown historian, and told us a lot about the stories of our people and what we went through in the partition. And my family, lived at the intersection of what is now Pakistan and India, and what it meant for our family to have lines drawn for us by people who are not us, and to live with the legacy of that forever. So when I see this clip, it really reminds me of the power of what it means to come together and to see, it's really easy to see folks as other than us. It's almost instinctual, right? To try to gravitate towards a group we see as us. But growing up as sort of the only Indian kid, the only Sikh kid in my class, pretty much always, I couldn't look at everybody as other. Otherwise, I would literally be on my own all the time. And so I often tended to find similarities, whether that was affection for Star Wars or like obsession with the Bulls or whatever it was, right? And so when I look at this clip, I think about the power of finding stories of similarity and how incredibly important it is. And we can't do that unless we have stories that we lean into and actually understand where we come from, where our people come from, and then look for understanding with groups that don't share our particular history.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Just as we transition to the next question, one of the things that really struck me was, which I was really pleased to see, is female voices and the stories of women and how they're experiencing these different stories were being really showcased and grounded the whole story. And whether it was Theresa Lee or even the first story, or even with the murder of Vincent Chin, not just Helen Zia, but in particular Vincent's mother getting the focus of the story of the courage and the strength she had to overcome that trauma. So, I think that was really moving for me as someone who has nieces that I also hope will be part of that better world in the future. Speaking of the future, all of you are doing such amazing work on behalf of the community right now. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about thoughts that you saw in the video or some of the stories and trends that we've maybe touched on a little bit here. How are you thinking about how it connects to the things that you're doing right now in your work on behalf of the community?
Well, I am, as most of you know, I think the only immigration lawyer in the Illinois General Assembly. And my own family's history has been really the driving force behind most of my professional career. My own family faced deportation under the Chinese Exclusion Acts, but I think like a lot of Asian American families, or at least in my family, speaking from my own experience, our family struggle was not something that my grandparents talked about a lot. I don't know if it was because they were so in the moment trying to achieve the American dream, or if it was a little bit of wanting just to continue to move forward and not focus on the past. But for me, discovering my own sense of purpose, discovering my own sense of self, meant looking at my family's history, meant looking back and connecting to what made me me. And I discovered in law school my own family's struggle under the Chinese Exclusion Acts, not realizing that it wasn't until those acts were repealed in 1943 that my family was able to own property in their own name. The things that were denied to my grandparents as immigrants to this country at a time when all immigration from China was illegal based solely on race. And I don't think that as a policymaker, as a lawmaker, you can ignore the legal racism that has been infused in our immigration policy. Without a sense of our own history, how can you expect to do better in the future? So reminding ourselves of our own American history, Asian American history, our connection to these struggles of the past informs how we confront them today. And I think we have examples all around us right now of how important it is to connect to those same struggles, because it is something that Patricia said really resonated with me. You talked about looking at these stories for a sense of hope. And I feel hope and optimism all the time in our shared experiences, the things that have defined who we are. But it's also empowering to go back and connect and to remember that those same issues confront us now. And the more that we can build coalitions around these shared values, the better we will be able to construct policy around the values that we know make us stronger as a society, make us stronger as a community. And so for me, it is my family's own history, our own struggles, that inspired me to go to law school, inspired me to run for a seat in the General Assembly, inspired me to seek connections with those who share my desire to make a difference in the world. And I firmly believe that you cannot do better until you know better. And so it's important to look back as we move forward.
Thank you, Jennifer. I mean, the Patsy Mink story, being told by the boys club to wait your turn, right? I'm sure that's something you can relate to. And on the immigration front, we did just recently see a suspension of all, effort to suspend all immigration as we know it. It does kind of hark back not just to the Chinese Exclusion Act, but, and maybe we forgot a little bit, in addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act, in 1924, all immigration from Asia was banned, right? And so hopefully we're not seeing history repeating itself there. But others, I know you're all doing amazing work in community. We'd love for our audience to hear more about that, but also, yeah, your thoughts about how it connects to what we're seeing in this video. Chris, could you maybe kick us off?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Yeah, there's so much to say thinking about how these stories of struggle and these themes around solidarity, themes around a lot of these the women that were featured in the documentary. I think about that a lot in terms of how many more people who also were a part of the struggle around Asian American organizing and the movement. And I'm particularly thinking about that in the work that I'm doing today around immigrant and worker rights and the fight for domestic workers, for their labor rights, their access to healthcare. And just like the farm workers, where that work, because of who they were, that was not valued, it's the same thing. And today you're hearing it, seeing it in an intersectional way, because it's women's work, because people are immigrants, because people are undocumented. And so I really think that those connections connect to that history in here today. We're seeing that, and so we really can learn from what those struggles from the past. And for me, seeing that history and knowing as a young person, I was lucky to high school be able to learn about Asian American organizing when I know a lot of people weren't. And so for me, that I really resonated with what I think it was Mimoa said in the documentary about how something clicked for her around this is how my experience is connected to this broader movement. And I think it really pushed me and motivated me to do this work as an organizer, to work in community. I don't think a lot of people are like, yes, this is the career that I'm going to do. It's because we have to. It's a part of our experience, our lives. And particularly around, I think about immigrant rights when our families are being torn apart. There's kind of the story of, people coming to the United States, and it's this kind of like fuzzy, like American dream and open arms. And I think something that I resonate with is that the story to that is actually when they went to Ellis Island, that it actually wasn't just this open arms thing, that it was a place where people were getting detained and there was violence and families were separated. And so I think about those lessons and those histories and bring them I see them showing up today and wanting to continue to fight back against those policies.
So there's a lot of ways that I want to respond to the question of how this work impacts us in the current work that we're doing. For me, I'm thinking about it in terms of like the layering of history that's happening and the things that are happening so close to each other, right? Like I'm thinking about Vincent Chin and his death in 1982 and the end of the Vietnam War that happened like just a few years earlier in 1975, right? And then a few years before that, in 1968, the Third World Liberation Front that sought to begin, well, it should be Third World Studies, but now it's known as Critical Ethnic Studies, and I could go into that a little bit later too, but just how all these histories are happening like not in a linear way to one another, right? Like there is no clear progress narrative. It's constantly imbued with like political and people's struggles to fight for their rights, to fight for better working and living conditions in many different ways. And so I was thinking about it in relationship to this time period, right? The late 1970s, the early 1980s, because my parents are Vietnamese refugees. My father and mother escaped from Vietnam after the Vietnam-American War, and my father was actually imprisoned for 4 years in re-education camps. And so I was really interested in issues of or I am really interested in issues of state violence and incarceration as a result of that in many different ways. But I'm thinking about like, how does this history localize itself within the Chicago context, within the Uptown context, within the context of Argyle Street, which is located in Uptown, that is more recently historically known as like a Southeast Asian neighborhood and district, right? What does it mean that in this moment in the late 1970s, you have this wave of Southeast Asians being forced to migrate and resettle in the United States context because of the loss of the war, right? And so we see the surge of like Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian. Simultaneously, we also see like the Great Migration, where there's like white Appalachians moving and organizing with the Black Panther Party in Uptown on issues of class, on issues of just like really breaking down how we're thinking about just working conditions and living conditions, right? And that we see this like cross-racial solidarity that's happening as this area is also being gentrified. So you see this layering of history that's happening that's really interesting to me. And so what I'm actually interested, I know this is for later, but just thinking about how I lost my train of thought, but just thinking about how like this documentary might unfold in regards to these shared history with other racialized groups, that it's not just contained within how we loosely define Asian America, but how are we thinking about it in relationship to Latinx communities, in relationship to Native American communities, and in relationship to Black communities, right? That are completely racialized and racialized differently, and that it's all within the same system. That when we're thinking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, or we're thinking about these acts that seek to deport Southeast Asians, that it's not disconnected from the anti-Black violence that's happening in the United States context as well. So just thinking about how all that relates to each other.
Definitely. Niketa?
Yeah, I think when I think about how this documentary inspires and connects with the work that I get to do at Q, I often think about, this very simple theme of belonging, and who sort of is seen as having the right to a voice, the right to civic power, and how that's divided, and how we're so often pitted against each other. And in Chicago, Q got started because of a fight for my local neighborhood school, and the school district sort of challenging the right of the school boundaries to exist where they were, and trying to change those boundaries, frankly. And in many ways, when we started to say, no, that's not acceptable, and the community that was organizing there was predominantly Black. It's a predominantly Black school. And when that community started to organize, the district's response was to sort of say, well, we're actually doing this on behalf of Asian Americans because Chinatown is right next door and has been asking for a high school for such a long time. And so sort of my own personal identity being between two worlds, right, and in this space was really this incredible moment to sort of realize why it is that my dad kept telling us these stories at the dinner table about division and factions and identities, and the ways in which there's this false narrative about our differences. And many of those themes keep coming out over and over again. And the idea that, there is this, there's just not enough. There's just not enough money. There's just not enough resources. There's just not enough power for all of you to have a say, right? So Q's work came out of that particular case, and we really started to organize, and we started to say that civil rights work in the modern era cannot be legal work exclusively. It needs to start with hearts and minds, but not stop there. There's a lot of this idea that, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion is about people understanding their implicit biases, and I would challenge that and say that understanding your implicit biases without working for policy change, without working for legislative action, without creating a different power structure is frankly a feel-good strategy and a band-aid on many of the challenges we see in our world. So Q's work is about how do we organize, right? How do we start with hearts and minds and seeing each other for who we are and our similarities, and then work from there to get to changing narratives, and from changing narratives to changing laws and policies. And so in that case at NTA, where we were founded, we were actually able to secure the first time in national history that we were able to stop a school closure on civil rights grounds because it violated and had a disproportionate harm on Black students. That's not a thing that we often say. Even if we know it's true, we're not able to prove it. And so the work we're doing is about thinking through, first of all, how do we connect people's stories to one another? How can I see your humanity as part of my humanity, and that all of our futures are tied in the same thread? And that if I believe in a democracy, if I believe in the idea that my voice matters, then I have to believe in the idea that your voice matters, and that, in fact, sometimes it's not about making sure that people whose voices have always been part of the political process are still there, but instead to say who's been excluded and how do we center those conversations and those harms that have been part of our history.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, a mission of my organization, Advancing Justice, is racial equity, and it's not in parentheses racial equity just for Asian Americans, right? It's for everybody, and we all, I think, many of us that we've just shared that know what it's like to not be heard and not be seen, and we certainly, as we fight for justice, don't want to do the same thing to other groups, right? While we're doing that, and I'm just hearing Kristina. I know it takes a lot of intentional work to even have a Pan-Asian unity and coalition. We're both members of the Pan-Asian Voter Empowerment Coalition that have been working with Jennifer for the last several years. But we're also members of the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Refugee Rights, and that takes, those are communities of color from all different immigrant communities, and that takes a lot of work to hear each other and listen to each other, and not try to gloss over the tougher conversations that we saw, for example, with the Filipino farm workers, right? Taking that brave step, reaching out to their Mexican workers and building real solidarity. And, last tidbit before we turn to the positive, I hope, or the future is, I did notice in the Vincent Chin story, Reverend Jackson and the Rainbow Push folks speaking in solidarity with the Chin family, and being reminded that this has happened before, all right? That folks have done this work, the work that Niketa is doing, that many of you are doing. It is possible. It's not easy, but it is possible, and it's encouraging to see that even decades ago that was happening. So I'm going to turn us a little more forward-looking with this series, and just ask all of you, this is going to be premiering on May 11th on PBS, and then May 12th as well, to finish out the 5-part docuseries. What are your hopes for the series? What are you most excited to see or learn, and then also related to that, just how might we use this series in the future or in the near future to mobilize the community to affect change and make the progress that some of you have spoken about. But yeah, I would love to hear from all of you.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to be with all of you at a time when it's so important that we continue to find ways to reach out and to connect. It has been such an honor to be with you all. For me, if people take one thing from watching this series, I hope they take away that we matter. Our history matters. Our shared struggles, our sacrifices, our dreams show our interconnectedness, not only to each other, but to the world. And that we gain only what we are willing to fight for. That, you know, to your point, Andy, about being seen and not heard. This is one of those things that in politics we struggle with a lot. Prior to Representative Teresa Ma being the first Asian American ever elected to the Illinois General Assembly, there were no Asian American voices in the Illinois legislature. Now there are two, with me being the second in the House, and then with Senator Ram Villavalam in the Senate. There are 3 Asian Americans for the first time in Illinois history representing Asian American voices in the legislature. That is progress, but we had to fight for it. We had to fight for it. We had to fight for it by making sure that we had a representative map that would enable Asian influenced voices to be elected. We had to fight for it by working with coalitions to build power and influence. And I think sometimes as Asian Americans, we feel like we can't demand to be seen. We can't demand to be heard. But I think if this documentary has taught us anything, it's how important it is to be visible, to be part of the conversation, to build coalitions. And so for me, I take away from this a renewed sense of purpose, a renewed connection to my own family. Was ahead of her time. She came to this country before women were allowed to vote. She was a teacher. She was one of the most important influences in my life. She always taught me that I could be anything in this country. She didn't live to see me elected to the Illinois General Assembly. I hope that through our work, we honor that history, not only our own personal histories, but the shared struggles and experiences of all of us, because that's what makes us Americans. That's what makes us Americans. And the American dream belongs to each and every one of us, and it's worth fighting for. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for giving us this moment, and I hope that it continues to inspire others.
Thank you. Others?
Yeah, I will, you know, what I would say in terms of what I want to see with this this series is I hope people use it as a launching point to have these conversations and really reflect on what was the history and struggle of our community, and seeing that it was a part of that struggle was seeing workers, seeing parents, seeing families coming together and building solidarity with other communities and struggling through that, but in the end coming together and fighting for their rights. And so from those lessons, I really hope that people take from that a moment for us to think about what is the long haul a vision for us to build with other communities in order to make sure that all of us thrive, whether it's in the Asian, Black, Latinx, Indigenous communities, and making sure that we're in relationship with other communities along the way, and knowing that we're a part of this broader movement. And so for me, I'm really, really am excited to have this film provide that space for people to start thinking about, and think about what are the values that we're going to instill in the way that we we build a movement. And those values are around, dismantling white supremacy, making sure that we are fighting back against the model minority myth that we can't be silent. Silence or compliance does not mean your safety. And it's also our duty not to fight for our communities. And so that's something I really hope people take away from this film, and I'll end with just remembering one of the popular things that they would say at the farm workers meetings is isang baksak, which means one fall, which translates to one fall in Tagalog, which is basically this idea of solidarity, and that all of us are connected and drawn together. And so that is our work, and that we have to make sure that we're supporting each other and fighting for each other, because our liberation is really connected in that way.
Definitely. Patricia, Niketa?
Absolutely. Before I continue, I just wanted to thank Advancing Justice for hosting this. It's an honor to be on this panel with everyone here, and to hear you all reflect about the powerful work that you're doing, and the heart with which you enter this continued struggle in many ways. For me, in this documentary series, I'm interested in seeing three aspects, actually. One is like the intergenerational connections, just kind of drawing from what Jennifer shared about your grandmother, just thinking about my own father having escaped war, but he's been a community organizer in Chicago for over 40 years. And we see also in the documentary, we see intergenerational struggles of mothers and daughters, of mothers and sons, right? Of parents and their children and the generations after. So I'm really interested in this notion of togetherness, of what it means to fight for each other in both like the traditional notions of family, but in a more expansive notion of family, in the way that, as echoing what Kristina was saying, our liberation is tied up in one another's liberation in many ways, and how do we ground ourselves from that point as a place of continued struggle. The second thing that I'm really interested in is artistic production. Like Asian American cultural production is really beautiful and amazing in different ways. How has cultural production and artistic practice been used to mobilize people? How has it been used to make our stories heard and centered in these various ways? And for me, I'm thinking about it in relationship to Asian American spoken word artists who were so pivotal in the 90s for politicizing a lot of young people in the United States context. And then the last piece that I'm really interested in seeing is just like, how have people mobilized? What are some of the strategies and tactics, and what are the like historical political context that they were working in and struggling through? How can we learn from their lessons in terms of like what has worked, what hasn't worked, and the bonds that have kept them together in different ways? And what does that look like cross-racially, right? That it's not just within Asian America as like a fixed identity of sorts, right? Because it's not. It's a political identity in many ways. It's a tool of collectively mobilizing together. And so how has that been used with other racialized communities of color? And how can we continue to enact that in different ways? And the way that I see this documentary series as a tool of mobilization is through education. For me, I teach in Asian American Studies at Northwestern, but I also teach community classes in Uptown, teach-ins, workshops, and I'm really interested in the form of the documentary as a vehicle that allows people's voices, people who actually experience these histories and their families' experiences, to share it, and for people to feel that history through the retelling and the importance and power of narrative and what it offers, especially in thinking about what does it mean to work in a field that fought, like literally the Third World Liberation Front, that fought for ethnic studies, that what it manifests today to be. In 1968, They were hosed down. They were met with police batons and extreme violence just to ask for curriculum, just to ask for a non-Eurocentric curriculum that centers their people's history, their people's struggles, and to shed light on histories of colonialism and US imperialism. So what does it mean to continue that fight to learn these histories so that we don't repeat them, so that we have a better future?
Yeah, yeah. Niketa.
Yeah, I mean, Patricia, I love what you said about, you know, our families and the idea of this expansive family. So kind of like pulling on that string, I think my first hope is for our Pan-Asian American family, and for people watching, you know, we have so few images of representation in the public narrative, and oftentimes it's, you know, frankly, it's Asian American representation for white gays. You know, Asian Americans cast into roles hunting down terrorists on primetime television is not the kind of representation that speaks to me. But I think about this series as being the kind of representation that would have been really incredible for, you know, a 13-year-old version of me. I was in my freshman year of high school when 9/11 happened. And so growing up in a household and having family get-togethers with men who wore turbans, and then living in a world where that was told to me that that's what made us unsafe. Like, we were not to be trusted. We're not fully American, right? So seeing this version of what it means to have an Asian American story, not an Asian story, not an American story, like truly the intersection of our identities and our history in this space, and what belonging means for us, is really powerful. And I specifically want to think about the beautiful way in which women's representation was weaved into the storytelling in this series is really powerful, because I think many times, right, there's this idea of Asian American women being subservient and docile, and not having a voice, right? And this is an incredibly, I mean, it's a very Western, backwards idea, frankly, of feminism, that because we have you know, cultural practices that are different, that we don't have a beautiful celebration of power. And I'm not saying that from my generation. I'm saying that because the stories I grew up on are of my great grandmother, who was widowed at a time where property rights were not given to women anywhere, certainly not in India, and she still fought to make sure that her daughter had a college education and became a teacher for her community. So the power of women's storytelling in the Asian American storytelling in this series was really powerful to me. And I hope that our Asian American community, our family watching this, is able to take that and say, you don't actually, not only are we not a model minority, right, but that the stories of sort of fitting in, not challenging the status quo, not challenging white supremacy, that's not our role. Our role has always been to challenge and to disrupt and to further thinking, right? And so I really hope for folks who are watching, you know, Latinx folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks, white folks, who don't have the same Asian American history that we do, that they're able to watch these stories and hear and think about where our stories intersect, and hopefully find those moments where our struggles intersect, and where there's sort of this, oh, that makes sense, why we would do this work together, why it's not just about us showing up on the front lines kind of from an idea of mutual liberation, but from an appreciation that these are our shared struggles. This is part of my lineage. This is my family's legacy, just as it's your family's legacy.
Definitely. And for me, I just share, I hope everyone watches it, not just the Asian American community. We know, and you know, Niketa, similar to you, growing up here in the Midwest, I didn't hear any of this history until I got to college, you know, and so my hope is that for the next generation of students, that they're exposed to this sooner, that they don't have to wait, no offense to Patricia, they don't have to wait till they get to undergrad in Asian American Studies, which is fantastic that it exists, but we want to start the conversation even earlier, so that these stories are in our subconscious as we try to process even the current. right? Which we all know is kind of bananas, right? There's that, and to non-Asian Americans, to other Americans, I hope those watching today that you, as allies, as partners in this work, that you'll encourage your friends, your family, people you know, to also watch, right? And have those conversations about how the Asian American story fits into this larger story that we're trying to weave together. So I am so grateful for all four of you joining. Patricia, Niketa, Jennifer, Kristina, thank you so much for joining us, for watching the video and taking the time out of your very busy schedules to have this important conversation. We are so grateful here at Advancing Justice to have you all as partners in this work. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, all. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this conversation, for this pre-screening event. As far as Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago's work in the near-term future, we look forward to working and following the lead of our partner, FIRE, as they fight for family medical leave on the state level when session returns. We hope that everyone is continuing to respond to the 2020 census. It's critical that you tell your friends and family. If they haven't done so yet, please respond to the census. It's important that we're seen and counted this year. And for Advancing Justice Chicago, two new initiatives that we'll be launching in the near future. One is in partnership with PBS, our affiliation will be releasing a kindergarten through 12th grade school curriculum that will be widely available and free. Our hope is here in Illinois, we'll be launching what's called the TEACH campaign, which is Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History. We think it's really important in our public schools that our young people learn these stories, know these stories, so that we can maybe disrupt some of these troubling patterns that we've seen that continue to repeat themselves. And then in response to the hate incidents, which we are seeing in the news, we will be launching what are called bystander intervention trainings earlier in the nearest future. This will help us equip community members to disrupt and de-escalate potential verbal harassment or hate incidents, hopefully preempting them from becoming much worse. And so if you'd like more information about this, please follow us on social media, sign up for our email newsletter, and we will keep you updated. Finally, I'd like to thank our panelists once again for their amazing conversation and for their time. A special thanks to WTTW, our local PBS, for being such an amazing partner in putting on this Asian Americans pre-screening event. And also a big thanks to our funders that help make all of this possible, with a special shout out to one of our biggest supporters, the Wallace H. Coulter Foundation. We could not have done this without you all. You're deeply appreciated. And then finally, for those of you out there that are essential workers, just our eternal gratitude for your bravery, your service in this time. For the rest of us, I pray that we will all stay safe, stay home, and we will get through this pandemic together. So thank you all. I hope everyone has a great weekend. Take care.